Today, I'm going to, of course, mostly talk about the rise of fascism, between the world wars. Of course, this leads to the outbreak of World War II, also called, the Second World War. So I'll kind of talk about that, of course, in today's lecture. We'll talk about the rise of like Mussolini, Adolf Hitler. They're part of the reason why, Europe goes on a footing of war again after they had World War I, as well. So anyway, from last time I had talked about, had some previous lectures I had on World War One. Of course, in Europe, they had this war which ended with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And of course, that really didn't solve the differences with Germany. In fact, Germany after the war sought revenge. They think that's part of what later leads into World War II breaking out. Today, I'll be kind of talking about the rise of the fascists, like in Europe, which kind of becomes real popular, especially since things like democracy, capitalism really weren't working correctly after the war. And so they kind of have more faith in these totalitarian dictatorships like, Hitler and what Mussolini does in Italy as well. So I'll kind of get into and discuss those kind of topics, of course, today. So we'll first talk about, of course, like I said, the rise of fascism, between the wars and all that. So yeah, I wanted to talk about first today, you see there, the Weimar Republic. That, of course, is one of the main things that would, of course, develop after the war, where what happened was after World War I, Germany created this Republican state, which it has different names I'll kind of get to in a second. But the Weimar, what happened was it would be created after the Germans had this revolution break out in 1919, known as the so-called German Revolution, which lasts from 1918 to 1919. And anyway, basically socialists and others took over the government and they replaced the constitutional monarchy that had been under Kaiser Wilhelm II, should be, who actually abdicated to the Netherlands. And so they put in this new Republican type of government at that point, and it was known as the Weimar Republic, which hence they got the name from the fact that in it they had kind of formed a new constitution in Weimar, Germany, which is like central Germany, which I think was signed, I want to say, in August of 1919. Mostly it was the Social Democrats, which Hitler would complain they were kind of seen as these November traitors or whatever that had supported this new state. And that's traditionally what they would call the German state, at least in the West, from 1919 to 1933, before Hitler and the Third Reich came in under the Nazis. Actually, the Germans called it really the German Reich, is what they called it, Deutsche Reich, of course. And some people also call it the Dutch Republic or German Republic. So it's kind of like the predecessor to the current, republic now, the federal republic that they have now, of course, in Germany. And yeah, it was a liberal type democratic republic. One of the things that was interesting about it was it gave people direct representation, so they could have a right to vote, which all men and women could. Even representation where even I think women could serve in the German parliament as well. And the Weimar itself, the state, included a bicameral parliament, which had two chambers to it. They had the Reichstag, which was like a lower house, and they had the Reichsrat, which was like an upper type house. And the difference was that the Reichstag was more of a type of legislative body where they would elect people directly from the German people. It's more like the House of Commons, I think, like say the British model. And the Reichsrat was where the German states would appoint people to the parliament. It was considered like an upper house, almost like the House of Lords, I think, in Britain. Over there. But yeah, the Reichstag was really considered more important, and whichever party had the majority, which usually they would end up being, of course, the prime minister, what they call a chancellor in Germany. And yeah, the Germans, they would get rid of the monarchy, if you know about this, and they replaced the king or emperor or Kaiser, they called it in those days, with the president of Germany, which became more of a ceremonial position that you can see. Which up on the top left there, you can see that's Hindenburg, Paul von Hindenburg, who would later be one of I think, the second president of Germany. And they have the chancellor, of course, that was like the prime minister that would control the actual government itself. Today, the actual, if you look at the actual parliament system they have today in Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, of course, the current chancellor, of course, is Olaf Scholz, who, of course, we'll talk about some of these others that they have as well. I do have some. I think I've got listing some of the, if I have it or not. Oh, there they are right here. But yeah, these are some of the early presidents that they had of the Weimar Republic. You see on the left, Frederick Ebert. He was considered one of the first presidents of Germany from 1919 to 1925. I think he had actually been like a prime minister under Kaiser Wilhelm before he abdicated. And then he became like the president of Germany after that. And then on the right, you had also, you see that other fellow right there. By the way, Ebert was, by the way, basically the top politician that was the head of the Social Democratic Party, or SPD, which is, by the way, the current political party that's in power now in Germany, which Olaf Scholz is, I guess, the one that's the head of it. But now the guy on the right, of course, is Paul von Hindenburg, who, you know about him, is a former World War I general. In fact, one of the most famous generals in World War I on the German side. They built like Zeppelins after him, the Hindenburg Zeppelin you may have heard of. That's famous. He served between 1925 and 1934 as the second president of Germany. Of course, dying in office before pretty much Hitler seized power after that. Of course, Hitler would be the third one. I guess it would come in after that. They'd have as well. Now, yeah, of course, there's the actual Reichstag building where the Bundestag, that's what they call the actual German parliament today, which holds their meetings there, you can see. But the Reichstag originally was the actual lower house, of course, which actually was held there. Now, talking about the Weimar Republic struggled after World War I. There's different reasons for it, but predominantly, the main reason was a combination of there was a post-war depression that hit Germany after the war, where they had the transition from wartime to peacetime. Also, the Germans owed a lot of high debts that they owed from the war, because the war effort put a lot of money into it. They owed banks. And also the war reparations that they had to pay the Allies, which I think totaled over $70 billion, which you see there was equivalent to like something like $1 trillion that they owed. And so that definitely was one thing that caused it. And then later you'll see by the 1930s, the other thing that was, of course, that helped it too was the Great Depression, which really made it worse overall. It led to the rise of, Hitler and the Nazis, kind of like radical parties that would take over the country because people started to listen to Hitler because things weren't going well in the country. And so that's one thing that's really going to happen, of course. And in fact, it got so bad, like if you study about Germany during that time, they had like hyperinflation that was really bad, that mostly occurred under President Ebert. Of course, on the right you're looking at there, but they had a deal where they got to the point where they were printing like $1 million marks. Dutch mark was the, I guess the dollar for us. And so you had people like basically taking money and it was worthless. And you could see that they used it for different things. Like kids would play with it and make blocks out of it. You got women on the left there, making clothes out of it, using it as wallpaper. The one on the top right's using it to burn in her furnace, keep warm in the winter. And so money was like worthless in Germany. It took like practically a wheelbarrow full of money to actually buy something like in the store or whatever. It's kind of like inflation today, but not that bad. you know, you know, $40 for a steak, like now, I guess. So yeah, so that's basically kind of the things that kind of allow the fascists to really seize power because things aren't economically going well at all. And so yeah, in Europe you get the rise of fascism, the rise of totalitarian type dictatorships that take power after World War One, starting in the 1920s, 1930s. And that's one thing I'm going to talk about today, exactly. And that's the background of fascism. What exactly is fascism? Well, fascism is primarily this right-wing political ideology that favored ultra-nationalism. They talk about Benito Mussolini. He was considered the archetype or prototype fascist in Italy, who would come to power in the 1920s. And he said at one point that that fascism was a movement born out of the need of action. And fascism was a type of movement that opposed things like they didn't like anarchism, they didn't like democracy, they certainly didn't like Marxism, especially communism was something they totally rejected. They kind of rejected a lot of civil liberty, so a lot of your civil rights were kind of taken from you. They were definitely not considered liberal. They were more to the right, being more conservative. They are very pro-militaristic. They believed in rebuilding the military, rebuilding the state, expanding their state like it's an empire, those kind of things. And the quote I sometimes use, which is kind of famous, of what Mussolini said about fascism, he seemed to kind of believe it was more like a populist movement originally. Fascism was not the nursling of a doctrine previously drafted at a desk. It was born of the need of action and was action. It was not a party, but in the first 2 years, an anti-party and a movement. So I think there's even a theory that Mussolini thought it wasn't really left or right, more like a populist movement, more than anything. But fascism's not like communism. Communism, doesn't like things like capitalism. The fascists embraced capitalism, although they talk about fascism being more maybe state control over it, especially in Germany. I know they supported the idea of private property rights, that people could own private property and things like that, that there's a market economy, things like that as well. That people also, they can have a lot of wealth. They're not going to take your wealth and give it to the state or anything like that, because a lot of the fascists, they needed these wealthy people. In fact, Hitler, it's part of how Hitler came to power, was courting a lot of wealthy people, industrialists, and things like that, more or less. The Nazis were more racist, if you know about this. Back in Germany, going back to probably as far back as the 1800s, they pushed these ideas that the Nazis were like some superior German race, the Aryans and things like that. They also thought that Jews, Slavs, and other inferior races existed. And so they were very anti-Semitic, especially the Jews, and they would, create the Holocaust, in the 30s and during World War II, that would not just kill Jews, but other people that the Germans felt like were a threat to them, etc. Of course, you can see Mussolini at the top right there, also right here. Mussolini, like I said, was considered really the first major fascist dictator to really rise to power in the 1920s. Mussolini was prime minister of the Kingdom of Italy from 1922 to 1943. He was also propped up as a fascist dictator in northern Italy when he lost power in 1943. Interesting figure, Mussolini. He actually originated as a veteran of the war. Like a lot of these fascists like Hitler, Mussolini, started out really as veterans in World War I, like fighting in the war. And he kind of bounced around from different jobs. At one point, he was a school teacher, taught children in school. He worked as a journalist, and it's kind of interesting about this, but Mussolini really started out as a socialist. In fact, they think that the fascist movement was really a left-wing movement originally, and then because of the communists, they went more right. That's what occurred. So he kind of rejected the socialist Marxist thing and embraced fascism. And Mussolini, what eventually happened was he eventually embraced a political party movement in 1919, forming what became known as the National Fascist Party, also called the PNF, for short. Which, like I said, they had heavily rooted in ultra nationalism. They wanted to restore Italy to be not just a major power in Europe, but he saw Italy as being the next new Rome. Like he wants to make it into this new Roman Empire that's going to dominate the Mediterranean Sea, North Africa, etc. So he wants to restore Italy to be like it was a long time ago, etc. So what he did was, if you know about this, he adopted this symbol or icon, which became known as the fasci. The fasci is an ancient Roman symbol that goes back hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, the fasci was actually a symbol of Roman authority, where I guess magistrates had power over others, life and death. And the fasci actually represented a bunch of rods that were bound around an axe. And in fact, the word fasci means bundle, if you want, in Latin. And I guess the rods symbolized that the Roman people were were a lot of things but one. Many but one. And so that became the symbol that they started using. They use it on flags and other symbols. And so the PNF became real powerful by the early 1920s. Mussolini had this paramilitary force that he starts to form later. Here you can see Mussolini, of course, doing the fascist salute, which fascist salute was a little different than the Nazi salute. I think theirs was more straight up than at an angle. It was probably more like the old Roman salute. They think that went back to the Roman Empire, because I think the theory about the salute, the fascist salute, is that it originated from the idea of Rome with the emperors, when they would salute people or troops, etc. And but yeah, they had these so-called later the March on Rome that they would have, and Mussolini had these paramilitary force that he used to seize power that were called the Black Shirts. They were kind of part of the NFP or NPF, which sometimes called the Squadrissimo, and it's kind of like similar to the Nazis' SA, the brown shirts. You may have seen their uniforms, which were more of a brown color, which theirs more black. And a lot of these were ex-veterans from the war that were involved, and he would use them to seize power. In fact, a lot of them would go around and beat up people that were, considered like their enemies, like socialists or communists. And over time, he had something like, I want to say 300,000 troops were in it, were part of the Black Shirts, this paramilitary force, which was also sometimes called the Voluntary Militia for National Security. And in Italy at the time, in the early 1920s, there was fear that a civil war would break out, that fascists would fight Marxists, communists or socialists in the country. And so what Mussolini did was he staged this March on Rome. It was like a mass demonstration, which happened, you can see, October 27th to the 29th. It was called the March on Rome, and it ended up being like a coup d'etat is what it really was. In the end, he would use it to basically seize control of the state, or they would have war, like civil war, in the country. And so the actual king at the time, his name was Victor Emmanuel III. He basically was forced to appoint Mussolini as prime minister. And so Mussolini was able to seize power really without firing a shot. He did it pretty much through mass demonstrations and all that overall. So he would come to power in 1922. Mussolini, though, he would basically, over time, he would put himself in as a over time he would become a totalitarian dictator. It's one of the things he would do. It would take him a while to do this, but I think between 1925 to about 1927, Mussolini eventually put the fascists all in the Italian government. And within so many years, it became this fascist militarized state. And he started using the title Il Duce, which meant the leader for the Duke. And so that's the title he kind of went by, of course, in power up to like World War II overall. So he did it through kind of like peaceful means in a sense, took over. And then within a few years, he started really even dressing up in military style uniforms and things like that. And Hitler kind of did the same thing too at first. He was kind of just like he's wearing a suit and then they convert to being more military looking. So that's kind of how these totalitarian fascists, they're kind of like military dictators. It's kind of what they become over time. Now I'm going to move on next, of course. We're going to talk about also the rise of Hitler today as well, because Hitler's, a major influence, of course, in why World War II would break out. Hitler is not really German. If you know about this, he was born originally in Austria in 1889. And he, in his early life, he actually had lived in Vienna for a while. In fact, for a while, he had studied to become an artist, which that didn't work out. And then World War I broke out in 1914. And so he joined the actual Kingdom of Bavaria's army and became kind of a hero during the war. He even got, I think at one point, an Iron Cross as a medal. And so they think that what happened after the war was that Hitler decided to join this political party that was, of course, known as it was originally called the German Workers' Party, but it eventually was spawned into this right-wing political party that Hitler would kind of rename by 1921. He would use this to propel himself to take over Germany, which later on he'll become Chancellor of Germany in 1933, pretty much a totalitarian dictator until the end of World War II in 1945. Of course, they'll call Nazi Germany later also the Third Reich as well. He later changed the name of the party. The actual political party's name becomes known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which, if you want the German initials, it's NSDAP. His enemies, like the enemies of the Nazis, called him Nazi for short. And so the name stuck. And so they became known as the Nazi Party. The actual German, if you want, is right here, Nationalistische Deutsche Arbeiter Party. So that's where the NSDAP comes from, if you wonder where the initials are with that. They would even put it on flags and standards and things like that overall. And this party was very pro-German nationalist. It was ultra nationalist German party that basically was anti-communist to the core. They hated Jews. So it was very anti-Semitic. And the one thing about Hitler and the Nazis, they wanted to restore Germany to prominence. They wanted to make it, a great power again after World War I. And they wanted to restore the German military to the way it was. Because, German military has traditionally been pretty good going back to, I guess, the 18th, 19th centuries. And, of course, the big thing he wanted to do, if you know about this, he wanted revenge against those that had, he thought, betrayed Germany. What he called the so-called November criminals that had, agreed to the Armistice after the war, and I guess later the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. I think the Nazis call it the so-called legend of the stab in the back, but they got stabbed in the back and all that, which probably not, but that's something they believe. And so that's something that he's going to eventually, of course, do. And over time, the Nazis by the early 1920s will even adopt a type of symbol or icon for their party, which of course was the so-called swastika, which in the West we think of pretty much Nazism and white supremacy, I guess today now with this symbol. But Hitler supposedly designed the actual symbol and flag which he used the red, black, and white colors with it, which a lot of these colors were colors that were used originally with the German flag going back years ago. And so it kind of represented, Nazism and the Aryan race or master race of the Germans and all this that he kind of believed and all that. And they sometimes call it the Hakenkreuz, I think is the other name they sometimes use it for. And it was later incorporated into things like with the Iron Cross, which went back to the Teutonic Knights in the Middle Ages. And then the eagle symbol was also another symbol they used as well, which went back to ancient Rome, like the Roman Empire or whatever. So you can see how it's kind of incorporated with other symbols. Iron Cross you see there, and even with the eagle being used with the swastika as well. Swastika, the weird thing about it is it's actually an Eastern symbol. You see a lot with religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and originally it was actually a symbol of like good luck, prosperity, or fortune. And so they kind of took it and used it for their own crooked means. And now it's kind of seen as that in the West as being something that's more evil. But it's really not to Eastern like religions. It's a symbol of good, which is weird. Now, also, I want to talk about as well some of the men that were behind Hitler. These are some of his people that were leaders that were under him that later would be part of Nazi Germany, like in the 30s and during World War II as well. And here's a couple right here that were very famous that were under Hitler. These two probably were the two most powerful men that were under Hitler. The one on the left is Hermann Goering, who went back to World War I. He was a World War I ace that had flown with the Red Baron. And he helped head up later in the 1930s the German Air Force, which was called the Luftwaffe. And he would be notorious also for founding the Nazis' secret police, which was known as the Gestapo. And then he also helped create some of the early concentration camps that would be kind of part of the Holocaust later, like Dachau in Germany. Dachau. And then the guy on the right, who you see there in black, you have Heinrich Himmler. Himmler would be eventually pretty much majority 30s and 40s, the head of the Gestapo, but he was also the head of the SS. The SS, which stood for Schutzstaffel, known as the Protection Squadron, was this special organization that was created by Hitler under the Nazis that really dealt with internal security. They're almost like a police force as well. And they were involved, as you know, in the Holocaust later. They helped run like the concentration camps and the death camps that would be, of course, like in World War II. They think under them, they helped the Nazis kill somewhere between 10 to 15 million people during Europe, but maybe even killing up to maybe 6 million Jews overall. They had some elite forces later. If you study about the SS, they had the Waffen SS as well, which were elite military forces that Hitler developed during World War II. They believed that they were just the master race, pure Aryans and all that. And they were kind of deemed separate from the German Wehrmacht, the German army, and all of that. They also had the Einsatzgruppen, I think, which were considered part of the SS as well, which were these killing squads that would go out and kill people, especially in Eastern Europe, like Jews and other groups. And so the SS had all these different organizations that were kind of notorious as being part of the Holocaust later. You also got Ernest Röhm. He was head of what they call the SA, which was also called the Brown Shirts, or if you want the SA's name, Sturmabteilung, which meant Storm Detachment. And the SA kind of started out as Hitler's bodyguards. They used the SA to kind of protect Hitler at Nazi rallies or when he would have meetings at beer halls and things like that. Ernest Röhm joined the Nazi Party with Hitler in 1919. They were actually close friends, but Hitler later had him eliminated, if you know about this 1934. But the essay was pretty powerful. I think at one point, about 3 million Germans were in it. And it was a rival to Hitler for a while, but Hitler had eliminated the essay and put it in like the actual German armies and all that. But Ernest Röhm was pretty powerful too. I think, like in the 30s, you had pretty much Hermann Goering, Himmler, and Röhm. Those three were probably the ones that were up there pretty high up with Hitler. They also had Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was Hitler's minister of propaganda. He controlled like the media, like the newspaper, the radio, and so on. And Goebbels was a mastermind of using propaganda to basically brainwash the German people, force Nazi ideology on everybody. And he's part of why the Holocaust happened, because people believed that the Jews were vermin and things like that and needed to be exterminated, and so they used that to make it happen, of course, later. They also have Martin Bormann. I usually kind of mention him as well. He was pretty powerful under Hitler, especially in the 1930s up to World War II. Bormann was Hitler's private secretary. He knew probably more things about Hitler than anybody else did. And he eventually will be the chief of the Nazi Party's chancellor. He pretty much ran the Chancellery building in Berlin, especially during the war. Some people think he was the most powerful man under Hitler as well. They think Bormann, died at the end of the war. It's kind of a mystery about what happened to him. Some people think he survived the war, and some people think he was killed at the end of the war. Now, I'm going to move on. I'm going to also talk about as well. Hitler, of course, later will try to come to power in Germany in the early 1920s, especially in Munich in 1923. So I'll try to kind of talk about next Hitler's rise to power that he'll have in Germany. And in the 1920s, Hitler attempted to seize power in what later historians call the Beer Hall Push, which was this attempted coup to overthrow the Munich government in Bavaria, which Bavaria is in the southern part of Germany. He was going to use that to create kind of a revolution and take over the country. I guess create a Nazi revolution and take over and create Nazi Germany at that point. And anyway, the Munich police stopped it. There were like 3,000 Nazis tried to march on the government, and he was stopped by the police. Hitler was arrested. I think 16 Nazis got killed, and he eventually went to prison. Here's kind of the Hofbrauer House, which is kind of famous now. One of their beer halls, I guess, that's in Munich, Germany. But suppose that's one of the places where the actual beer hall push started, like on November 8th. I think Hitler marched in there, shot his pistol in the air, said, "We're going to have a revolution now." And anyway, he was arrested, though, charged with treason, and he eventually went to prison, where he was supposed to serve, I think, 5 years, but he only got 9 months in the end. But famously, when he was in prison, he decided to write a political testament you may have heard of called Mein Kampf. You see there on the left. And Mein Kampf, which means in German, my struggle, helped outline a lot of his causes of what he was going to do when he took over Germany, what the plans were, for the Nazis and all that. So it's kind of like a political testament of what the Nazi cause was really all about. There's also an autobiography which went into like his early life and how he had struggled, from, I guess, his times in Vienna and after World War I. The one thing about, Mein Kampf was it did tell the future about, what Nazi Germany was going to do. He talks about this idea of Lebensraum in their future empire, where he wanted to expand Germany eastward. He wanted to take over Poland. He wanted to take over maybe Russia and colonize it, to expand Russia, because he believed that the Germans needed living space to grow as a state. He also talked about, I'll get to Anschluss later, but he wanted Austria to join with Germany. He also talks about eliminating communism and exterminating the Jews. So he already talks about the idea of the Holocaust in that book. And Mein Kampf is part of why Hitler survived. Like after he got out of prison, he practically made money off of the royalties of it. And so it helped the Nazi movement survive because it wasn't really that popular in the 1920s. In fact, Nazism won't be really big until the Great Depression happens overall. But if you got married in Nazi Germany, one of the first things they would do as a wedding present, they would give you a copy of the Mein Kampf, basically. Interesting. I'm not sure if anybody read it, though, but some people did. Now, I want to get to, of course, we'll get later to Nazi Germany expanding, of course, you see in that map. But Hitler, of course, is going to eventually come to power. Part of why he will eventually be able to seize power in the 1930s is because of the Great Depression. The Great Depression, of course, which started in the United States with the stock market crash, 1929, that would actually spread. The Great Depression would spread all over the world. It would affect Germany, creating mass unemployment. You can see at 1.6 million Germans were unemployed. And so people started to listen to Hitler and his messages, what he wanted to do with the Nazis. And he took advantage of the airplane. If you know about this, he used the airplane to campaign all over Nazi Germany. And so in 1932, he thought that the Nazis were becoming popular enough where he could run for the presidency of Germany. And so he decided to run against Paul von Hindenburg, who at the time was the incumbent president. And so was actually somewhat of a close election overall. But in the end, people were kind of worried that the Nazis were too radical to take over the country at that time. And so Paul von Hindenburg would end up being elected for a second term. He basically lost. However, you can see he lost by 6 million votes right there. Hitler got 13, 14 million votes. And Hindenburg got 19 to 20 million votes, you can see. But one of the ironic things about those elections that happened in 1932 and also in 1933 was that the Nazis would gain an actual majority in the German Reichstag, which I think was something like 37% of members would be in there now. And so that enabled the Nazis to eventually form like a coalition government with Hitler as basically as the chancellor at that point. And so that's going to eventually force Hindenburg to make Hitler chancellor, which happens in January of 1933. I think it's January 30th, 1933 is when Hitler becomes chancellor of Germany. And Hindenburg, by the way, didn't really care for Hitler. I think he called him that corporal or something like that. That's what he called him, because I think that had been Hitler's highest rank in the German army. I think he liked Hitler the way he was kind of expanding the military, or very pro-militaristic, and I think that's the one thing that Hindenburg liked about him the most overall. And so a lot of historians think that when Hindenburg appointed Hitler to become the chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, that's what starts, of course, Nazi Germany, or the Third Reich. And of course, the Nazis call it the Third Reich because they believed that this was the Third Empire, the one after you had the Holy Roman Empire, you had the Second Reich of Germany up to World War I. Now, they said the Third Reich, the Nazi one, would last 1,000 years. Of course, which lasts over 12 instead, but that's what they said would happen. Now, what would happen, of course, after Hitler would take over? They thought they could control Hitler with this coalition government, but you'll see that between 1933 to 1934, Hitler's going to come in and he's going to consolidate his power and make the Nazis create this one-party totalitarian state. that they'll have. And he used democracy to seize power, and then he squashed it. Creates like this Nazi party state that you have. And I'll kind of explain how Hitler was able to do this. It kind of happened by accident, believe it or not. There was this incident where in February of 1933, the Reichstag building burned, called the Reichstag fire. And apparently this Dutch communist, who I believe was I think he was a bricklayer named Marinus van der Lubbe, he set it on fire, like he burned it. They think he was a communist, and I think there's a theory even that he was this like a pyromaniac. He liked to set things on fire. They do think he did it. They think he set it on fire. I think that's one thing they know for sure. And so he eventually confessed to it. But Hitler used it as a pretext to take over the country, is what he would do, because he said that there was some kind of communist conspiracy to take over Germany, which probably wasn't true. But Hindenburg was kind of in agreement with it as well. And so they passed a bunch of these acts that became famous in 1933, which I'll put them on the screen here. But Reichstag fire decree was one of the first ones that they issued, of course, in March of 1933. And then the Enabling Act, of course, was the other one that they issued also as well. What's the difference? The Enabling Act basically gave Hitler dictatorial powers, which I think was supposed to last for like 4 years. And it made the Reichstag kind of like a rubber stamp, is what it did. So he kind of becomes a dictator because of that. He would renew it twice, 1937, 1941. Then the Reichstag fire decree was basically this decree that banned political parties that weren't Nazi. So if you're a communist, social democrat, whatever, socialist, a lot of those parties were banned in the country. And it also nullified a lot of German people's civil liberties. So the Fuhrer practically had life or death over you. He could have you killed if he wanted. He was that powerful, of course, afterwards. But they do think he did it. I think they used to say that it was just something that the Nazis did, that kind of thing. They actually do think he did burn it down, but I don't think he was really. I think what he wanted to do, I think there's a theory that he was trying to start some kind of revolution against the Nazis. And later in modern times, I think in 2008 it was, the German government exonerated him because anybody that's against the Nazis later was seen as a hero. If you know that in Europe. Here's, of course, the burned Reichstag building. Ironically, Hitler would later have the Reichstag would meet in, I think, an opera house in Berlin. And Hitler loved operas, if you know about this, like Richard Wagner, I think especially. There, of course, is the building now. That's where the Bundesrat, of course, meets today. The actual main German parliament, of course. They've kind of restored the building as you're looking at it. So yeah, it did burn. I guess they never fixed the top of it. They put that other top on there now. Part of it burned, of course, you see there before. Now, the thing that's going to happen after, of course, that occurs between 1933, 1934, is that Hitler's going to eventually purge a lot of enemies from the actual Nazi party. He especially purges Ernest Röhm, who really was his biggest threat in the Nazi party. In Germany, Röhm was pretty powerful because of the SA, the brown shirts. And so the so-called Röhm purge, or they sometimes call it the Night of the Long Knives, Röhm and other Nazis were killed in June, July of 1934. And so with that, Hitler was able to consolidate his power in the country overall. Then he forced the military to even, give allegiance to him as well. Hindenburg would die afterwards too. He would die of natural causes later in August of 1934. And so Hitler would take the actual two offices of the German chancellor and the presidency, and he would create one position out of it, which was called the Führer, which meant leader in German. And this was done in a national plebiscite where people voted for him to take power as Fuhrer. And I think a majority of people basically voted him in as actual the ruler. So after that, people started calling him the Fuhrer, as you know. They even had posters like that on the left, which said Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer, which means in German, one people, one empire, one leader. And so that was one of their big slogans right there. You can see Hitler, of course, giving the Nazi salute, of course, on the right. One of his, I guess, rallies in the 1930s was what it was. So yeah, Hitler is really, will take over Germany. Even for Jews, it's bad. I'll kind of get to the Holocaust later, but they even passed the so-called Nuremberg laws, 1935, that actually stripped citizenship from Jews in Germany. Many of them were later arrested and put in concentration camps or later killed. And so under Nazi laws, Jews couldn't marry, people that were German. They couldn't have sex with them or anything like that. So they had these purity laws that they passed throughout the country. And that's what, like I said, later began the Holocaust, which some people think the Holocaust began really in 1933 when the Nazis took power overall. So yeah, the next thing that's going to happen, the Nazis are eventually going to, under Hitler, are going to try to expand Nazi Germany. And several things that Hitler does by the 1930s that's kind of important. He'll begin to rearm the country. They begin slowly rearming and expanding the German Wehrmacht, which they conscripted several million men into the German army. They expanded their navy. They even began to build new battleships to compete with the British. And they, of course, expanded their air force. The Luftwaffe, of course, was created, which Hermann Goering was the head of, and which would be a pretty good air force during World War II and all that. And you'll see over time that Nazi Germany will expand. They'll try to get back territory that they had lost after World War I here. And one of the things that Nazi Germany would do is that they would start forming alliances in Europe that I wanted to talk about a little bit today. And so, you get Nazi Germany starts to align with Italy, fascist Italy. That's something you see quite a lot. And I think at first they call it the so-called Rome-Berlin axis, which was something that Mussolini had coined originally around 1936. And so later during World War II, the powers that fought on the fascist side were called the Axis powers, which had Germany and Italy, and then Japan joined in 1940 with the so-called tripartite pact, as they called it. And a few other countries in it too. I think Hungary, Romania, I think a few others were kind of in it as well at one point. But those are the main powers that'll fight the Allied powers, of course, during World War II. And so, of course, it's Hitler and Mussolini. And Mussolini at first didn't really like Hitler initially. I think he kind of distrusted him, but over time realized that the two had to kind of get together, and it became like an economic and then later a military thing between the two states overall. Japan was kind of an odd thing in it, because they're Asian and all that, Asiatic power. But they I guess they saw themselves as solemnly together against the other allies later. Of course, one thing that's famous about a lot of the fascist states like, Italy and Germany, they actually were kind of supportive towards other dictators. Like in Spain, they had Francisco Franco, who was a Spanish general that seized power during the Spanish Civil War, which happened right before World War II broke out. And what happened was in Spain, there was a deal where a civil war broke out between both sides. You had what was the more leftist side, which was like Republican Spain, I guess they called it, which was backed by communists and also anarchists. There were anarchists that were in the country. They were in support of Republican Spain, and the Soviet Union was the one that mostly sent money, weapons to him, all that support him. And then on the nationalist side, you had the Spanish Army, which Franco was one of the top generals that was involved. And they were backed by people that were conservative, those that were pro-Catholic. The Catholic Church was, still pretty powerful in Spain at the time, and also monarchists that wanted, I guess, to put the monarchy back in because Spain had been a republic since the 1930s. They had overthrown the monarchy back in the early 1930s, and so that would lead to Francoist, Spain after that. And was Franco really a fascist? That's been kind of debated about that. I think some people call him a semi-fascist, more like a right-wing or conservative dictator. That's definitely what he was. But he really helped to give support, to like fascist Italy, Nazi Germany. Spain kind of, was neutral during World War II. They did tend to support the fascist side, of course, in the war, and not the Allied side. Franco was surprising. He died in the 1970s, and one thing he would do, he would help Spain transition back to being really a democracy. And so, really, since the 1970s, Spain has been a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, which I think the last two rulers I know that were king were King Juan Carlos I, and then he had a son named Philip VI, or Philippe VI is the current ruler now, of course, that they have. It was kind of a miracle. If you study about going back to the 60s and 70s, there was a so-called Spanish miracle where Spain kind of began to restore its economy and all that, which Spain for years had problems, Now I'm going to talk about the next thing that's going to happen, of course, with the Nazi. Germany is going to expand eventually. And one of the things that he's going to do, of course, that's well famous. He's going to seek revenge for the Treaty of Versailles, because some that the Germans had been wanting to do, of course, for years. And one of the first things that the Nazis did in 1936 in March was they marched right in and took the Rhineland back, which the Rhineland had been a demilitarized zone after World War I. You can see here they began expanding. You see that western part of Germany, they would take that back, which was next to France and Belgium. So that was one of the first things that they would do. And of course, the Allies kind of stood around and watched. They didn't really do anything to take it. It's kind of like when Vladimir Putin took over Crimea, basically, and they just put sanctions on him. That's all they did. After that, they didn't try to take it back or anything like that. So it's kind of like that, I guess, if you want. So that was the initial thing. Then the other thing that happened in 1938 was the Germans then marched in and took over Austria, and they annexed it into the Third Reich, which the Germans would later call it Anschluss, or I think if you want the translation, joining. And so Austria was forced to kind of join the Third Reich up to World War II in 1945. And so the Nazis referred to that later as the so-called Greater Germany. That's what they called it. The whole Anschluss thing, by the way, was part of the so-called German question, which for years had been talk of all Germans living under, one state. And so Hitler had this dream where all these people that were German would be basically under one state and not non-Germans. Of course, the other thing they talk about, which is a big thing that would cause almost World War II to break out, was the so-called Sudetenland crisis that would occur. And this was a deal where they, over Czechoslovakia, mostly the part of the western part, Hitler demanded that they give him the area of Sudetenland, which had native Germans living there, or I guess Sudetenland type Germans. And it led to a diplomatic conference that happened in late September of 1938, where Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met in Munich, Bavaria. And I think I've got a map showing it somewhere if I could find it right here. Here it is right there, the map of the Sudetenland. And you can see it was that area. It's kind of in that dark brown area. Those are areas where they had Germans living there, maybe about 3 million, I think is what it was. And so he threatened either to, invade if they didn't give it to him. And so what ended up happening was the Western powers decided to appease him. In fact, that's part of why World War II broke out, was because of the fact that you had a case where, if you look at the different members that were at the conference, one of the most famous on the far left is Neville Chamberlain. Of course, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, United Kingdom. He basically appeased Hitler, is what he did. He gave in to his demands. And so they agreed on September 30th of 1938 to give over that territory to Hitler in exchange for peace. So it was called either the Munich Agreement or the Munich Pact. I think the Czechs later call it the Munich Betrayal because they felt betrayed by the Western powers, basically sold out Czechoslovakia because eventually Hitler is going to overrun the rest of it within several months. But they do think that the Munich Agreement is one of the best examples of appeasement, where the Western powers tried to, appease Hitler, in exchange for not going to war. In a sense, really, it did the opposite. It actually led to World War II breaking out, but it wouldn't really break out until almost a year later overall. So, yeah, that's of course one thing that's real famous about Neville Chamberlain. He would actually return to England afterwards, Britain, and he became famous for having this piece of paper that he had Hitler sign, which Hitler said that he would, I guess, not take any more territory after the Sudetenland. And so Chamberlain said erroneously that I believe it is peace for our time. And so this proved to be totally wrong, of course, several months after that, because one of the things that would happen, right afterwards is that basically Nazi Germany would go, they would take the rest of it. Like in 1939, they would march in, take over the western part of Czechoslovakia where Prague is, and then they would march into the eastern part of the Slovakia part, take that too as well. And then in September of 1939, they would also invade Poland as well. And so they start figuring out that they can't trust Hitler, but I think Chamberlain was kind of naive. He thought that Hitler was a man that he could trust, and they find out that's totally not true overall. So yeah, they think they have peace at that point, but they'll see that it's sorrow for Prague and other countries that'll get overrun eventually by Hitler. You can see those are the areas that, of course, that the Nazis would take over. Yeah, that area in the western part, where I guess the Czech Republic is now, was called Bohemian Moravia, which became a German protectorate in 1939. And then the eastern part was called Slovakia. You can see. And yeah, the Germans were butchers in Prague. They would kill a lot of people. The Czechs, if you know about this. And so, yeah, they were just brutal the way they took over parts of Eastern Europe. And Poland was the same thing also as well. So we're going to talk about it later. Of course, we're going to get to World War II, later in the week. I'll get to how, World War II breaks out, and I'll kind of get into the early stages of the war from 1939 to 1941. I'll probably talk up to at least when the United States enters the war, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. We did have some students that had been, I think, came in and watched. Hey, Diamond, what's going on? You're having a great afternoon as well. It looks like Trey's also watching right now. So hope y'all have a great week overall. But just before y'all go, don't forget, I had reminders about assignments, of course, that are out there. Y'all had, of course, yeah, the first exam. I think most of you have probably taken it. You're watching now, but those that have not taken it, of course, I think I've got it going to expire tonight. If you haven't done it, for those that have late completions, But y'all should be concentrating now on the second exam, getting that wrapped up. And you got other assignments out there too. Second vocab due, I think, by Friday. And then the British Rise of the British Empire quiz is also due, I think, sometime, I want to say end of the week as well. So those are all your main assignments you should be looking at right now overall. So that's pretty much lecture-wise for today, of course. Like I said, I'll talk about, World War II this week. Probably all after the Mardi Gras break, I'll kind of continue finishing up World War II because both those will be live lectures, of course, I'll have. But we do have Mardi Gras coming up. Don't forget, the school, I think, will be closed Monday, Tuesday next week. So y'all take care and have a great, of course, week out there.